Did Joseph Smith prophesy about the coming of the United States Civil War? One of the stories you'll often hear is that Joseph Smith predicted a war between the U.S. North and the South that would commence in South Carolina and be primarily over the slave question. It's rooted in a revelation that he dictated on Christmas Day, 1832, that he then touched on at several points going forward, especially in instructions that he gave to the saints in April 1843. Both that and the revelation were later canonized in the Doctrine and Covenants. But plenty of elements about this story get lost, despite the fact that they get mythologized much later on and become a core part of the Mormon teachings that Joseph Smith was a prophet because look at the evidence, he was able to prophesy of the coming war. Among the elements that get lost in this broader story, however, is the context of the initial reception, that it was on the eve in 1832 of what many expected to be a civil war, and that many of the details concerning that prophecy can be found and were rooted in that contemporary era, including newspapers that he had access to. What also gets lost is how the prophecy evolves over time and how it fits into a shifting perspective of the Latter-day Saints and their relationship to the United States. And finally, what gets lost is the broader context in which this revelation was dictated, understood, and then adapted. That there were lots of people expecting a civil war. And so what makes Joseph Smith's teaching significant is not their exceptionalism, but their ubiquity. This story is actually a great case study in understanding the tools of historical context and scholarly inquiry. And since this is part of my Friday video series, so you want to know more about X, we're going to be digging into the documents, and we're going to be talking about how historians should approach them. Hopefully, I'm hoping to use this story as an example for the historical method. So in this video, I'll give some basic background to Smith's revelation, including reading the primary text, as well as touching on how it's been interpreted within the LDS tradition. I'll then provide some more historical context on the world in which the revelation was created and interpreted, and then I'll examine how the revelation tells us a lot about not just Mormonism, not just Joseph Smith, but an antebellum culture that was on the verge of war nearly every year. And by the way, antebellum here is pre-war, so it's quite relevant that we're talking about Joseph Smith's antebellum revelation about the Civil War. Let's dig in. Now, Joseph Smith spent Christmas Day, 1832, thinking about war and calamities on the nation. This is how the history of Joseph Smith that he and others put together years later explained this context and the revelation I'm about to receive. Quote, "Appearances of troubles among the nations became more visible this season than they had previously done, since the church began her journey out of the wilderness." So there you see them identifying the cultural context and what was going on as the prompting for this revelation that Joseph Smith dictates on December 25th, 1832. Dictated by Frederick G. Williams, one of the common scribes for Joseph Smith's revelations, later copied in Revelation Book 2, which you can see here. This is the earliest manuscript copy we have of it. He titled it Prophecy Given December 25th, 1832, concerning war. They include concerning twice there. It was in a polished copy. Notably, this revelation does not make it into the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants or even the 1834 edition of the Doctrine and Covenants for reasons I'll get to in a bit. But this is the direct transcript that we get from that earliest manuscript. And it's not too long, but I want to read the whole revelation here because various elements are going to play a role in our discussion today. Verily, verily, thus saith the Lord, concerning the wars that will shortly come to pass, beginning at the rebellion of South Carolina, which will eventually terminate in the death and misery of many souls. And the days will come that war will be poured out upon the nations, beginning at this place. For behold, the southern states shall be divided against the northern states, and the southern states will call on other nations, even the nation of the Great Britain, as it is called, and they shall also call upon other nations in order to defend themselves against other nations. And thus war shall be poured poured out upon the nations, and it shall come to pass that after many days slaves shall rise up against their masters, who shall be marshaled and disciplined for war. And it shall come to pass that the remnants who are left of the land will marshal themselves also, and shall be exceedingly angry, and shall vex the Gentiles with a sore vexation, and thus with the sword and my bloodshed the inhabitants of the earth, and by bloodshed the inhabitants of the earth shall mourn, and with famine and plague, and earthquake and thunder and heaven, and the fierce and vivid lightning also shall the inhabitants of the earth be made to feel the wrath and indignation and chastening hand of Almighty God, until the consumption decreed hath made a full end of all nations, that the cry of the saints and of the blood of the saints shall cease to come upon into the ears of the Lord of the Sabbath, from the earth to be avenged of their enemies. Wherefore stand ye in holy places, and be not moved until the day of the Lord come, for behold, it cometh quickly, saith the Lord. Amen. You'll note that, like many of these early manuscripts of the Revelations, there has a bit of a run-on quality here, where Joseph Smith is trying to present all these ideas that do not come across as polished and framed as the later canonized versions, when we add punctuation and clear delineations from verse to verse. Now, that's not the only time that Joseph Smith touches on this prophecy. A decade later, in 1843, he delivers a set of instructions to the saints as he's visiting that later get canonized as D&C 130. By the way, this revelation, D&C 130, that I still need to do a whole video on, is a bit of a mess in how it compiles these abbreviated notes of Joseph Smith's sermons on various occasions into one streamlined revelation that does not really match the context in which they were created. But in this case, Orson Hyde, who is an LDS apostle, was riffing on a dream that Joseph Smith had on March 11th, the previous month, about having to raise the Nauvoo Legion to defend a patriot cause. And Orson Hyde kind of gave his interpretation of that dream, that it was going to be required to defend the United States. And then Willard Richards records Joseph Smith's response, quote, "Interpretation by Orson Hyde, old man government of the United States, who will be invaded by a foreign foe, probably England. U.S. government will call on General Smith to defend probably all this western territory and offer him any amount of men he shall desire and put them under his command." But here's Joseph Smith's correction. "I prophesy in the name of the Lord that the commencement of the bloodshed as preparatory to the coming of the Son of Man will commence in South Carolina. It probably may arise through the slave trade. This is a voice declared to me while I was praying earnestly on the subject, 25th of December, 1832. So there you have it. These two sections eventually become canonized in Doctrine and Covenants, and they are the core parts of Joseph Smith's prophecy concerning the Civil War. So let's now talk about how those texts are interpreted. By the way, if you enjoy this kind of content, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. Every Monday I do deep dives on topics. On Wednesdays I connect the past to the present. And then on Fridays I talk about the historian's craft, pulling the curtains back on how historians do their work, either through engaging classic works, interviewing authors on new books and articles, or in this case, looking at the sources behind common historiographical claims so that you can see what type of work is being done that's typically only found in the footnotes. And if you want to give back, and I'm so grateful for the many of you who have given back, you can become a member, where for a very nominal fee, you get early access to the videos, you get icons next to your name when you leave comments, but most importantly, you can feel good about supporting public-facing rigorous scholarship. And as a new perk that comes with the membership, I am soon going to commence a new series titled Mailbag Mondays, where I respond to some of your questions more in depth, more than what I can do in my live videos, and more than what I can do on my Sunday discussions on Instagram. That's coming soon, so make sure to become a member. Go to my posts here on YouTube, find the link, and ask your questions. Speaking of the live, the next live that I will be doing on this channel, that I try to do the first Wednesday of every month, will be on Wednesday, August 5th at 7 p.m. Mountain Time. It should be a lot of fun. We'll be discussing the lingering issues over race following the 1978 revelation, a topic that I've covered a little bit in some recent videos. So mark your calendars for Wednesday, August 5th at 7 p.m. All right, let's get back to the prophecy. So, as I mentioned briefly earlier on, this revelation that Joseph Smith dictates on December 25th, 1832, does not appear in their first edition of the Doctrine and Covenants in 1835, which the revelations that he dictates before and after this do, nor does it appear in the 1844 edition of the Doctrine and Covenants. The first time it appears is in 1851 with the publication of The Pearl of Great Price by Franklin D. Richards in Liverpool, and this will eventually become the Pearl of Great Price book of scripture. And then it also appears by Orson Pratt in the church's newspaper in Washington, D.C., titled The Seer in 1854, which included several pages of Orson Pratt's own analysis. And in fact, Orson Pratt is going to be one of the frequent popularizers of this prophecy and its significance to the Latter-day Saints, and I'll return to that soon. And then as Latter-day Saints start publishing this revelation frequently, it gets picked up in the broader news, especially in the late 1850s and then early 1860s as the nation comes to war. And one section that many Latter-day Saints will highlight comes from a newspaper titled the Philadelphia Sunday Mercury in 1861, which included Smith's prophecy and said this is the preparatory paragraph: "We have in our possession a pamphlet published at Liverpool in 1851 containing a selection from the revelations, translations, and narratives of Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism. The following prophecy is here said to have been made by Smith on the 25th of December, 1832. In view of our present troubles, this prediction seems to be in progress of fulfillment, whether Joe Smith was a humbug or not." By the way, humbug is typically a shorthand phrase used as a false prophet back then. It then quotes the revelation, the entirety of what we now have as D&C 87. And then it says this, quote, "The war began in South Carolina." This is referring to the Civil War that just commenced. "Insurrections of slaves are already dreaded. Famine will certainly afflict some southern communities. The interference of Great Britain on account of the want of cotton is not improbable if the war is protracted. In the meantime, a general war in Europe appears to be imminent. Have we not had a prophet among us?" That's a phrase you'll often see trumpeted out by the Latter-day Saints in defense of this prophecy. Have we not had a prophet among us? And Latter-day Saints, of course, used this and ran their victory lap, saying that this is Joe Smith predicting the Civil War. Brigham Young, George A. Smith, Wilford Woodruff all give sermons on this revelation in the 1860s, especially 1862 and 1863, when the degree of carnage connected to the Civil War becomes widely known. But none were as adamant as Orson Pratt. Here is the beardless Orson Pratt. We all know him more as the bearded Orson Pratt, of course. But here's a discourse he gave in 1870, years after the Civil War was over, that kind of captures this general sentiment of why they believe this revelation was proof of Joseph's prophetic gift. Quote, "I went forth before my beard was gray," even Orson would speak about his facial hair, "before my hair began to turn white, when I was a youth of 19, now I am 58, and from that time on I published these tidings among the inhabitants of the earth. I carried forth the written revelation foretelling this great contest some 28 years before the war commenced. This prophecy has been printed and circulated extensively in this and other nations and languages. It pointed out the place where it should commence in South Carolina, that which I declared over the New England states, New York, Pennsylvania, Ohio, and many other parts in the East, when but a boy came to pass 28 years after the revelation was given." He even at one point says that when people thought the war was going to begin in Kansas due to the Kansas war that was taking place in 1854 to 57, he says, no, it's not Kansas, it's going to be South Carolina. And then he goes on. "What did they have to say to me? They thought it was a Mormon humbug," again, that humbug term, "and laughed me to scorn. And they looked upon that revelation, as they do upon all others that God has given in these latter days, as without divine authority. But behold, and lo, in process of time it came to pass, again establishing the divinity of this work, and giving another proof that God is in this work, and is performing that which he spoke by the mouths of ancient prophets, as recorded in the Book of Mormon, before any church of Latter-day Saints in existence." So there you see Orson Pratt using this revelation, proved that Joseph Smith is a revelator, a true prophet because of this revelation. And it's under Orson Pratt's oversight that the new edition of the Doctrine and Covenants in 1876 includes that revelation, now that it had been verified in their minds. So that's the Joseph Smith revelation, his later instructions, and then how it's interpreted. But let's take a step back and look at those texts within their historical context. Because it is important to remember that when Joseph Smith dictates this revelation in December of 1832, they weren't looking forward to some future war. They thought the war was going to be happening then, because there was a conflict taking place in South Carolina that very month over what we call nullification. Now, I actually learned a lot of these details when I wrote my first book, American Nationalism's Imagining Union in an Age of Revolution, a book that none of you have heard of because it was before I turned to my Mormon history route. But in that book, I have a whole chapter in which I talk about the crisis over nullification. It's a long historical backstory. There are debates over tariffs, but it came down to who has authority to force things like tariffs on the states, with many South Carolinian politicians arguing that the federal government was overstepping their bounds. And the undercurrent throughout all those debates was slavery. The South Carolina worried that if the federal government became powerful enough to place a tariff on their trade that South Carolina didn't want, then eventually the federal government will be powerful to eradicate slavery, which the South doesn't want. And so there was lots of discussions. And in December of 1832, South Carolina holds a convention in which they nullify these federal tariffs and they raise an army to protect their rights. All of these details were covered in newspapers at the time, including newspapers mere miles from Joseph Smith's presence. Most notably, the newspaper The Painesville Telegraph, which frequently has exchanges between the Gentile neighbors, to use the Latter-day Saint term, and the Mormons. They have several articles in their December 21st, 1832 issue, including one article on the South Carolina Convention, one on nullification, one on potential war, and importantly also one on revenge and magnanimity, a tale of the cholera, which talked about these global diseases. In other words, Joseph Smith himself, in his records, notes his reaction to these stories. In the history that's being written in 1832, he writes about how he feared the immediate dissolution of the United States due to these accounts. And many of these direct references found in Joseph Smith's 1832 revelation have a direct corollary in those December 21, 1832 Painesville Telegraph stories. A predicted war to begin in South Carolina. Fears over slave insurrection as a true background issue that was not the forefront topic, but was the background topic. Fears of global plagues, as well as an apocalyptic and millenarian framing that was common for many in the era. Now, the Nullification Crisis ended up not resulting in a war. Henry Clay and other politicians were able to come together with the Compromise of 1833 a couple months later, and South Carolina has to hold off. But they did not think that that was the end of the crisis. Now, that might have played a role in why the Latter-day Saints did not publish that revelation of the 1835 Doctrine and Covenants, because it seems like it failed. It's not until later that they believe, it was vindicated due to what happened in 1861, rather than what ended up happening in 1832 or 33. But even when the text of the revelation is resurrected, so to speak, in the 1850s, showing that Joseph Smith did indeed prophesy this, that context itself also adds a lot of details. Mormons were not the only people who were expecting the nation to come to war in the 1850s. There's a wonderful book by the scholar Elizabeth Verone titled Disunion, the Coming of the American Civil War, 1789 to 1859, which is full of these details, very similar to Joseph Smith's revelation, from the 1790s all the way up into the 1850s. And so when Mormons start trumpeting Joseph Smith's revelation in 1851, when they publish it in the Pearl of Great Price and the Millennial Star, when they add it to the church's newspaper in 1854, and then especially when they start publicizing it during the Civil War, they were far from the only people saying, look, I told you so. There are many, many contemporary accounts with many, many of the same details as Joseph Smith also predicting the Civil War. And so that prediction of a coming disunion, starting in South Carolina, predicated on slavery, calling on foreign aid, all of those were common reverberations throughout the nation. Yes, there were some who argue that the war could be avoided, that all of these were just humbugs, to use the term again, predicting doom, but there there is also lots of people. I just finished a book on the abolitionist minister Theodore Parker, who is saying remarkably many of the same things around the same time. And even the newspaper accounts of Joseph Smith's prophecy probably should be read with a bit more nuance than the triumphant LDS accounts of saying, have we not had a prophet among us? If you read through those actual accounts in those newspapers, you can see that they fit into general categories. Either, look, even this buffoon could tell that the nation was coming to war. Or, look at the radical fears that we found on the fringes of what they called fire eaters during this time, and the Mormons were just one example. Or a condemnation of moderate elites. Look, all of you people who think that we can compromise and avoid war, you are even dumber than these radical prophets that we don't recognize. And the references like that famous, have we had a prophet among us, were often meant to be tongue-in-cheek of like, oh, look, we had a prophet among us, when in reality that prophet was saying the same thing lots of other people were saying. So it's a sarcastic barb. It's jostling the American culture. It's not really a vindication in their minds of the Latter-day Saints or their prophet. So in conclusion, the Joseph Smith prophecy on the Civil War is still a centrally significant historical text, but not in the ways that some people predict. It is significant because of its ubiquity, not because of its exceptionalism. In other words, it doesn't fit into the apologetic LDS defense of, look, Joseph Smith was a prophet, this prophecy was vindicated. Nor does it really fit into this anti-Mormon critique of, look, this is a prophecy that was clearly proved wrong. What the document does is it can do both things for both groups. It is an example of how religious and prophetic texts are interpreted, that believers are able to find a way to craft a narrative of Joseph Smith being proven correct, while also critics saying that this is an evidence of Joseph Smith's fraudulent prophetic power and the use of histories. The job of the historian is to cut through all of that and place it within context, showing that Joseph Smith's prophecy fit into other antebellum concerns about the Civil War, both about the Nullification Crisis, but the broader trajectory of the fear of disunion that the Nullification Crisis was just one part of. And so in the end, the text is an example of religion making. That's a term scholars use. That's a text that on its own can't fit perfectly into any of these categories, but once added into the desired context of either the believer, the critic, or the historian, it takes on added significance. I hope this video made sense. If so, please hit the like button, share with others. I hope this shows that the historical context often adds so many layers and so much more interest that typically gets shortened or condensed or flattened into simplistic accounts. If you enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe to this channel, become a member if you want to give back. History has never been more relevant than it is today, and this text is just one example of why the question still goes so much deeper than we sometimes assume.